Hello and welcome back to this damn Idealistic Crusade. In this video I'm going to go over the films I've picked up on DVD and Blu-ray, and of course the random VHS pickup that I have, because of course I'm always going to find a tape somehow, somewhere it seems. Just when I think I'm done tape collecting, I find another one. But these are all things I've found in local stores and one or two eBay pickups of just some really interesting titles. And as usual, I can't resist any classics, or especially any Warner Archive MOD DVD titles when you find them for cheap, because it's significantly cheaper finding them in the wild every once in a while than picking them up online for their usual list price. So to start with the DVDs, this first one I'm really excited about because it's one of the few Frankenheimer titles I've not seen. So this is actually the 1962 film All Fall Down, starring Warren Beatty, directed by John Frankenheimer. This was done in between, if I'm understanding the timeline right, it's the film he did in between Birdman of Alcatraz and The Manchurian Candidate. So of course, meaning he had three 1962 releases. So this is sandwiched in between two iconic classics, and it's always been on my watch list but has not had a lot of video releases. So this is the Warner Archive MOD release. This was done in their standard style back when they started doing MOD discs, and it is anamorphic 1:8:5:1, so it's actually in its original ratio, which is always great. Something the Warner Archive always does a really good job with their MOD releases. So this has just been on my watch list for way too long, and it's one of the few Frankenheimer titles I had just not gotten around to yet. So this was an amazing thing to just find floating around, because it's very rare to spot MOD discs in the wild, and usually when you do, it's going to be the more common stuff, or the stuff that Warner Archive has upgraded to Blu-ray perhaps. So I keep an eye out for the blue spines, and if I see it, I check it, because there's no telling what gem could be just randomly mixed in. So this was a really nice surprise. As was this title, which is actually an upgrade to the Laserdisc. So this is the 1934 RKO Katharine Hepburn vehicle, The Little Minister, which I have on the original Image RKO Laserdisc. And like a lot of these, my guess is usually when Warner Archive did a MOD disc, it's primarily going to be using this old LD master, but obviously being a little bit better in picture quality because it's DVD and they're going straight from the video master itself without having to bounce it down to disc. This is like most early 30s or most 30s Hepburn vehicles, especially pre-Bringing Up Baby and the iconic films we think of. If you look at her early films between Morning Glory and Bringing Up Baby, essentially, they're very kind of all over the place, but the key factor is she is usually playing a complete force of nature, and she is completely untamable, and that's why you come to these films and why they're so magical. Admittedly, usually the scripts are not necessarily the greatest, and they don't have the greatest reputation. They don't get talked about a lot, and they're not as good or as polished as the things we think of, the iconic Katharine Hepburn films or the films of the 40s that she would do, especially the films with Spencer Tracy. But there is something special about the 30s films where it's like they don't quite know what to do with her, except she is a force of nature and can't be stopped. This film has quite a bit of that. It's based on a J.M. Barrie story, of course, the writer of Peter Pan, and essentially it's got a sort of fairy tale aspect to it, because the Hepburn character masquerades as something she is not. The sort of idea of, she's not a princess, but she is of a rich, wealthy family, and she essentially sneaks off and disguises herself to live more freely, and then problems ensue when she meets other people in that guise. So you can recognize the sort of story that's going on, but it's charming enough, and you really watch the 30s Hepburn vehicles for the just unstoppable force of nature that was Katharine Hepburn. And she was never quite like this on screen again. If you compare the 30s films to even the 40s films, there is a certain degree of not necessarily that they're tamed down, but it was integrating that Hepburn energy much more into society, whereas the 30s films are much more Katharine Hepburn versus the world, and I do miss that that didn't carry over into the 1940s fully. It's still there, but it's like it's modulated a bit, and I think she had really discovered that was a way of being more successful with audiences in the Philadelphia Story, which is really the play and then the film that relaunched her career. So I think there was a degree of, okay, this is how how we should modulate the type of characters for having greater play with audiences, because of course before that there was the famous moniker of Hepburn being a box office poison, because all of her films she had been doing were notable failures or not surefire hits at all. So after a string of those, the Philadelphia Story is what relaunched her career, and she wouldn't really be doing these sort of forces of nature completely like she did in the 30s. So even though the 30s films that she was doing they usually vary in quality, some people love them, some people don't care for them, you can't deny the complete force of nature that Hepburn is in her 30s films. And there are classics in there. I mean, the real standout is 1935 Sylvia Scarlett, which is really one of the original cult films, because it was a total failure and sort of got rediscovered, and it definitely has a cult following. There are great films mixed in there, but this is one of those that sort of slips under the radar, and it's a lot of fun, but you watch it definitely for Hepburn's performance. Next is another archive title. This is a film I've not yet gotten to see, but it was on my radar, because of course I'm a total Western geek, and I especially love Westerns from this time period that deal with Civil War type stories. I think that's a fascinating sort of mini genre within the Western, the sort of Civil War tiptoeing over into the West. So you have stories that either take place around Civil War events or it's like skirmishes in the West. And of course, this was developed in the 60s and 70s when revisionist Westerns really started digging further into the history of the West and incorporating it more into the Civil War. But there are really fascinating Civil War based Westerns before even The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Of course, I think you could at least in a lot of ways talk about Major Dundee, which I have on this channel, because of course if I can talk about Dundee I will. But especially films like that, there are a number of Warner Brothers films, especially in the Errol Flynn westerns, like the very underrated Virginia City, and especially the 1950 just phenomenal western Rocky Mountain, which I think is really Flynn's best Western, and one of the great Westerns of the 50s. So I'm very curious about this film, also from the same year, and that's The Outriders, which is a Civil War Western starring the great Western legend Joel McCrea, and I am such a huge fan of McCrea, and I think he's one of the great underrated screen stars that if there's ever a film of his, and especially a Western I haven't seen, then I am totally game for it. So this is a archive MOD disc. It is credited as a remastered edition, so I guess maybe they just spiffed up the transfer a little bit. They do this every once in a while, but I never know what exactly that means, because you'll just see occasionally one has a remastered banner, and this is when they had switched over to doing poster art, which is what they'll do now on their DVDs, which is a really nice touch. So this is just another classic Western that I haven't seen, and especially because it's a Joel McCrea Western and it's a Civil War Western, it just seemed totally up my alley. Now this next one is, of course, a dollar bin pickup. It's a very common disc, but it's one that I wanted to get for a specific technical reason, because the sound mix for this film is iconic, and it's been remixed so many times that I think all the modern versions really, quite frankly, sound inferior. So I did finally get a copy of the original Top Gun DVD release, and the reason why is I'm pretty sure that this ports over the beautiful THX Laserdisc master that was done, I believe, in 1996. It was supervised by Tony Scott. It's framed a little differently at 2.0 to 1, but it did have a brand new 5.1 AC3 mix that was done directly from the original 70mm 6-track Dolby Stereo mix, and for my money, that is the best sounding version of the film anywhere. and it hasn't had any remixing applied to it because, again, the film has been remixed now several times in the DVD era, in the Blu-ray era, and now with the modern UHD release and the 3D conversion as well. So it's been remixed multiple times into 6.1 and 7.1 and beyond, and none of them sound as good as the old LD AC3 track, which still packs a punch. So I was very curious about this because most Paramount DVDs at this time were just ports of their Laserdisc. So I was very curious to see if the 5.1 on here is indeed that Laserdisc mix, which it should be. And if that is the case, it makes it a much easier way to obtain that mix, because AC3 on Laserdisc, you of course need an RF demodulator, and you'd have to capture it. You'd have to, sync the sides up to a modern transfer. Whereas here, you can just literally capture the DVD track itself. This is an early disc for Paramount, so it does have it's not a pan and scan version because, of course, this film was Super 35, so it has a 1.33 to 1 opened up transfer as well. And it's not a flipper disc, surprisingly. It's one of those early DVDs where it's actually single-sided, but you actually have both masters, both transfers on the same disc. So of course that means they're sharing space. So I believe this should be that 96 LD master. And again, I just picked this up. I've wanted to get this for just checking the AV quality and to see if indeed it does have that same amazing 5.1 70 millimeter mix, and it should be. So I just finally got a non-destroyed copy of this to check and see what the master is like. Now, this next one I picked up simply because it was so absurdly cheap. I had seen this on Amazon and other places before, but I didn't think it was that important, and I thought it was like a lot of modern multi-film sets on DVD. Not only are they repackages of just the old disc, but usually, especially when they're Universal, they just shove multiple films onto the same disc, and so you're getting the old DVD master, but in a much more compressed form. So that's why I avoid those Universal collections, even for films that are DVD only or very rare, because a lot of times you are losing significant amounts of bitrate because you have just imagine a dual layer DVD transfer shoved down with two other films onto a single disc. You're already losing massive amounts of bitrate, and this is, even though it's still standard definition, that does cause a lot of problems. So when there is a release that's a multi-film set at a bargain price where it is actually individual original discs, then I definitely sit up and take notice. So this is currently retailing for about $10 new, and I found a brand new copy for literally $2. So I was like, is this for real? So this is the 9-film Paramount DVD release entitled The Classic Western Collection. Now, I do have some of these already on DVD, but this was such an amazing bargain price for a lot of titles that do not have Blu-ray releases, or if they do, they are problematic. So even though I already have some of these, it was literally, priced at $2 for the whole thing. And then, of course, the rear just lists all the titles and the credits list. And it's a thicker case, which then I picked it up and I was able to very much ascertain that it was the original DVDs. So it's on one of these multi-tier hubs, which, of course, usually in shipping, these hubs are the first thing to go, so you will want to make sure, like any DVD case of this type, that you don't have a broken hub inside, because a lot of these you'll get it, and the little hubs on the top and the bottom will be cracked or something, and then you just have the little disc flaps floating around. So again, this is an amazing deal for, it does have at least one of the masterpiece westerns in Shane, plus two of John Wayne's best westerns, and then some really underrated ones, like Will Penny is especially underrated. And also, it gives you a title on DVD that has problems on Blu-ray, which is the classic John Sturges Gunfight at the OK Corral, which on the Blu-ray does have some unfortunate teal coloring and a 5.1 remix. It doesn't have the original mono track, which is here on the DVD, which doesn't have the color problems either. So even though it's a DVD release, and some of these titles do have essential Blu-rays, like the Masters of Cinema disc for Shane, for example, this is still a fantastic deal for a lot of titles that don't have Blu-rays or have problematic Blu-rays. And you also get the original discs instead of multiple films shoved down onto single discs. And at under $10, it's a great deal, and especially when it's on sale or you find it like I did, used, you can get it for literally $2 or $3. Next are two Kino Lorber Blu-rays that are actually out of print, so these were nice finds. This first one I have not seen, but it's 1969's Young Billy Young, Western starring the immortal Robert Mitchum, and if there is a Mitchum film that I have not seen, I must see it. So as a giant Mitchum fan, this was a great find, and also it is out of print. So once Kino discs go out of print, sometimes they do start fetching much higher price values, but usually they just get really obscure, so you have to pay quite a bit more and try to track them down. So this doesn't have any extras, but it is just one of the Mitchum Westerns that from his later career that I just never gotten to see. So it was nice to find an out-of-print Kino disc in the wild. Next was Kino's disc for What's New Pussycat. And of course, me being the gigantic Casino Royale 67 fan that I am, this is really the film that helped to spawn that and was the inspiration for what became the absolutely mad Casino Royale 67. This, of course, was produced by Charles K. Feldman and co-starring Peter Sellers, along with Peter O'Toole. Also was written by Woody Allen, so you have a lot of the same principal people going into Casino Royale 67. And it, of course, spawned the immortal Tom Jones song. But it has sort of a mixed reputation, but I did want to check this out on Blu-ray, and it seems to be an older MGM-based master, but it is out of print, so it is now fetching higher price values, and it was a surprise to see floating around in the wild because I missed out on this the first time around. It doesn't have any extras, so it's just a Kino disc with the film only. But as always, whenever you see an out-of-print Kino title, there's little chance on the more obscure titles that they're going to get another release. And especially with the MGM library now being tied up with Amazon, I don't know if anybody else is going to do this film again. As a giant Leone fan, this has been on my wish list for far too long. I have some of the older editions, but I never had the Image Blu-ray of My Name is Nobody, which was directed by Tonino Valeri, Leone's assistant director, and Leone produced this, but a lot of people like to claim that Leone sort of ghost directed this. Definitely has a lot of his influence, but he did not actually direct it. Of course, this brings back Henry Fonda into an Italian Western, so it's a must for classic Western enthusiasts, and you have Terence Hill from the Trinity films, but this is still a straight Western. It's not a comedy-laden Western like the Trinity films. This is a newer HD master. This disc came out in 2013, I believe. It unfortunately doesn't have any extras, but it is at least a solid version of the film, which, like most Italian Westerns, has a whole host of video releases in the past with their own issues. It's unfortunate that this isn't a special edition, because I think you could make a lot of nice extras for this, but I am wanting to finally be able to compare this transfer to the old Image DVD and the Universal Laserdisc that I have. That's a pretty nice widescreen transfer. So as usual with Italian Westerns and anything Leone related, you have to do a lot of comparisons of the releases and the versions that exist. And even this film that he only produced does have a whole bunch of different video releases. So I finally was able to get a cheap copy of the Image Blu-ray. Anytime I get a chance to look at a release from the Classicflix label, I am so excited to do so. They usually do a lot of titles that are much more obscure, and so this one I have not seen, but they do such a beautiful job with their Blu-ray releases and trying to do the absolute best and that they possibly can with the masters they have, and getting these films an actual release. That definitely makes me want to support them all the more, and I've been very pleased with all of the Classicflix releases that I've looked at so far. So this is their release of the 1947 comedy Out of the Blue. As usual, the beautiful original poster artwork on the cover, wonderfully reproduced, a really nice layout design as all of their Blu-rays carry. Like a lot of their releases, this doesn't really have any extras, except for they did actually make a new trailer for the film. So that's something they do that I think is really, really nice. For a lot of these films where there's no surviving trailer or they don't have one, they will actually go ahead and make a new one and put it on the disc. So that's a nice touch. So again, this is a title that I haven't seen. The Classicflix specializes in a lot of titles that are much more on the obscure side. They've done releases from the MGM library. This one is not actually licensed from a studio. This is licensed from I guess whoever owns the rights. So this is definitely a title that has not had a major video release history, which is what they like to specialize in, to sort of bring films to light. And they also, as usual, have some really nice interior art. So even though this doesn't have any major extras, it's still a release that is done with much care and much quality, as all of the label's releases are. If you've not checked out any of their releases, I highly encourage you to do so, even if it's a film that is one you may have never even heard of before. They do an exceptional job at presenting these titles and doing the absolute best that they can, and it's all the more admirable because they are a small label and they only can do one title at a time. So I really try to support them wherever I can, and if there's ever a release of theirs I can check out, I am so happy and glad to do so. Next is one of these Paramount Presents titles where they do the fancy slipcase and things. I'm not too big of a fan of some of the business practices and mastering practices that Paramount has started doing since they started opening their catalog up, because for years Paramount just didn't bother with their back catalog, which was crazy. But they are finally releasing some titles that are long overdue for an upgrade, and I couldn't resist an affordable copy of one of their Presents titles, because they do have higher price points and the transfers are a mixed bag depending on what title it is. But I saw a cheap copy of their release of the underrated Another 48 Hours. This is the first and unfortunately only sequel to the Walter Hill directed classic 48 Hours from 1982. And while this came out a number of years later in 1990 and didn't have the same reputation as the original film, it does hold up rather well. It has some of the grittiness of the original, and for me, I think the 48 Hours film, well, it's not really a franchise, there's only two films, but the 48 Hours series is a far better and more rewarding series than the much overhyped Beverly Hills Cop, if I'm being honest. I like Beverly Hills Cop just fine for what it is. It's okay, but I don't think it has any of the gravitas or the staying power or the grittiness of 48 Hours. So every time I see Beverly Hills Cop, I'm like, I wish I was watching 48 Hours instead. This sequel, I think, is very underrated, and it was heavily cut by the studio. So I had hoped that this would have meant that Walter Hill's director's cut would have been finally released, because it does exist, and Hill has bemoaned that Paramount cut the film. But unfortunately, even though this got a new 4K scan, and they made a fancy slipcover like they do for these releases, and they made some new extras by actually interviewing Hill, and like all of these, when you open the slipcover up, it gives you the original one sheet, but sideways like this, and it's like, yeah, this is cool, but you should have released the director's cut, Paramount. I mean, we've all wondered what it would be like and heard that it was significantly longer for all these years, so I don't know why they didn't do that if they gave this film a new 4K scan. This is like all the Presents titles. You then get a clear case with the art. Again, this does have a new interview with Walter Hill and the trailer. That's all you get for the extras, unfortunately. They didn't include any of the deleted footage, once again, which is a shame. It's nice that they're doing something special, but also this getting a 4K scan, it makes you think, why didn't they release this in 4K? And now apparently Paramount is starting to actually release Paramount Present titles in 4K, so you kind of have to rebuy the same thing you probably already bought, which again is another of their business practices that I don't agree with, and I think are really if they intended it, it's dishonest and making people buy things over again. But at least they are finally releasing titles from the back catalog. I should also say this has a 5.1 lossless track, which means the original mix is not included. This is really an upmix of the original 2.0 Dolby SR surround, but I would have preferred that been included and been the default track because I am admittedly an original audio purist. I do have this film on LD, and I have the other the two DVD releases, so it is great that they finally got a proper Blu-ray release, and I need to get the matching release of the first film. I've just held off because these Presents titles are usually very highly priced for what they are, which is unfortunate. They're priced like a Criterion release, and they're not, but you do get some fancy packaging, and you do get a new scan, which is at least something, because this is a title I figured just would never get Blu-ray because Paramount just seemed for a long time to just hate their back catalog. And then lastly, we have the lone VHS title that I alluded to earlier. This is a VHS exclusive title, and if I ever get a chance to pick up one from this series that is unfortunately VHS exclusive, this is one of the things I allow myself to buy a tape for, because I know it's something that's probably never going to get another release, unfortunately. But this is one from the Republic Serials collection. So this is The Black Widow from 1947. So it is much later on in Republic's serial history, which really lasted until the mid-1950s when the film serial finally died out. Republic is really the king of film serials. They are the studio most associated with cliffhanger action-adventure serials, and they really made it part of their name. So when you say Republic, if you're not thinking of serials, you're probably thinking of Republic Westerns or something else, but the serials really are what you think of when you talk about Republic. And even though the later 40s serials, they aren't as always as good or as seemingly as invested as the 30s serials, and especially the classic ones directed by the team of William Whitney with John English, which are basically the pinnacle of serials. They do have great charm, and they were still made extremely well for the most part, and a Republic serial, even from this time, is going to be better than especially a Columbia serial, for example. Republic did do these new transfers from their surviving film negatives, so these are official studio transfers. They released a good number of them on Laserdisc, I think about 10 or 15, but then there's another like 15 or 20 that were only released on VHS tape, and they've never been officially reissued again. So this is now the second one I've found, and when I find something like this for $1.99, I'm like, okay, yes, even though it's VHS, and I try not to buy tapes unless there's a specific reason like this. And to be honest, from the one I've started watching of the tape I already had of Haunted Harbor, the quality on these is actually really good. It's actually very much equivalent to the Republic serial Laserdisc that I have. So basically just imagine what you see on one of the Laserdiscs, but with obviously less resolution, but they still hold up quite well. This is in 13 chapters spread over 2 VHS tapes with hi-fi mono audio as well. So basically this is what you could have gotten on Laserdisc. They just only released it on VHS. At this time, the number of chapters started to vary. I'm watching Haunted Harbor right now, which runs 15 chapters. Republic usually did a 12-chapter serial in their heyday, like Daredevils of the Red Circle, which is one of the great serials, for example. But by this point, it seems they were sort of playing around with doing longer serials. So this one runs 13 chapters. Again, some would run 15. But it's a fascinating part of film history, I think, that should be far more researched and better known, because there is great magic in the adventure serials, even if it's one that's not as good or not as well written, or like this one getting on later in the years of serials, getting closer to the 50s when they would finally die off. This is an important part of film culture that has influenced every action or adventure film that came after it. The best serials are among the best action films ever made, and there is great charm to watching a serial, and it's best to watch them spread out. So you watch a chapter or two a night, or whenever you watch a movie, you then watch another chapter of a serial and keep it going. So if I can ever find more of these tapes, I will pick them up. A lot of these serials do have a lot of gray market releases, and you'll find them on YouTube of varying quality. So that's why I try to find the official best studio transfer, even if it is a VHS tape like this. And some of those YouTube uploads sometimes are actually captures of these tapes, and that's probably the best and easiest way to try and find these VHS exclusive serials, but you can't beat going back and getting the actual release that a lot of these public domain or gray market or YouTube uploads are directly made from. So this was a nice find, and this is one of the VHS type exclusives that I will pick up whenever I stumble across another one. So here's the shot of all the spines, if I can hold them all straight so you can see them. So that's what I've found recently in terms of video titles on various different formats. As usual, I'm completely floored and surprised at what I can find just digging around local stores. And of course, eBay is your best friend, not necessarily for your wallet, but you never know what will turn up on eBay or various other places if you're hunting for used discs. And as always, I try to chip away at various directors and stars that I'm a great fan of, or it's really wonderful to find rare and obscure things, whether it's an MOD disc or especially for out-of-print titles and VHS exclusives as well. So I hope this has been fun and at least somewhat informative. Hopefully this has maybe spurred you on to check out some of these titles if you haven't seen them, or dig something out that you haven't watched in a while. And definitely keep supporting your local independent stores for whatever you've got, whether it's a record store or bookstore that sells movies as well. Keep your disc spinning, keep physical media alive, and thanks ever so much for watching.